Imagine waking up one morning, picking up your phone, connecting it to a monitor, keyboard, and mouse, and realizing you no longer need a traditional PC. Not as a backup, not as an emergency option, but as your main computer. For years, this idea sounded like tech fantasy, something promised in flashy keynotes and forgotten a year later. But now, something different is happening. Android and Linux, two platforms that quietly shaped modern computing in different ways, are slowly converging into something that genuinely threatens the traditional desktop. Not in theory, not in demos, but in real-world daily usage scenarios. And once you start connecting the dots, it becomes very hard to ignore the direction this is heading. Android was never designed to replace desktops. It was built for touch, for small screens, for short interactions. Linux, on the other hand, has powered servers, supercomputers, and serious workstations for decades. The idea that these two worlds could merge into a practical desktop experience once sounded absurd. Yet today, Android runs on top of a Linux kernel, supports desktop-class applications through containers and virtual environments, and increasingly borrows ideas from traditional desktop operating systems. Meanwhile, Linux desktops are becoming more user-friendly, more polished, and more compatible with mainstream work. The gap between mobile and desktop is shrinking faster than most people realize. Look at how powerful modern smartphones have become. Flagship Android devices now ship with CPUs that rival entry-level laptops from just a few years ago. They have multiple high-performance Corte's dedicated AI accelerators, fast NVMe storage, and surprisingly capable GPUs for everyday tasks like browsing, document editing, media consumption, coding, and even light video editing. These devices are already overkill. The hardware is no longer the limitation. The real question has been software, user interface, and ecosystem. And this is exactly where Android and Linux are starting to overlap in meaningful ways. Desktop modes were once treated like gimmicks. Early attempts felt clunky and unfinished. But today, Android desktop environments are no longer just stretched phone interfaces. They support resizable windows, proper multitasking, keyboard shortcuts, external displays, and even multiple monitors. Connect a phone to a display, and instead of mirroring your screen, you get a desktop-like workspace. This alone changes the way people think about their devices. One device, many roles, phone in your pocket, desktop on your desk, media center in your living room. At the same time, Linux applications are becoming more accessible on Android. Projects that allow full Linux distributions to run inside containers or virtual environments on Android have matured rapidly. You can run Arch Linux, Ubuntu, Debian, or Fedora directly on an Android device without rooting it. Inside these environments, you get real Linux tools, real package managers, real desktop environments like GNOME, KDE, XFCE, or LXQT. This is not emulation in the traditional sense. It's Linux running on Linux, sharing the same kernel, using the device's native performance. This matters because it means Android devices can now run the same software stack people rely on for real work. Code editors, compilers, scripting languages, servers, containers, and even food development environments are now possible on a phone or a tablet. Developers can write code, run tests, host local servers, and deploy applications without touching a traditional PC. Students can learn Linux, programming, and system administration using nothing more than their phone. For millions of people around the world, especially in regions where PCs are expensive or unreliable, this is a massive shift. Then there's the rise of progressive web apps and cross-platform frameworks. Many tools that once required a desktop operating system now run perfectly in a browser. Cloud-based IDs, office suites, design tools, and collaboration platforms. Don't care whether you're on Windows, macOS, Linux, or Android. Combine this with a Linux environment for local tasks, and suddenly Android becomes a surprisingly complete desktop replacement. You're no longer locked out of serious work just because you're not on a traditional computer. Another key factor is input. For years, touch was the biggest limitation of mobile devices. But today, Android handles keyboards, mice, trackpads, styluses, and game controllers extremely well. Keyboard shortcuts work as expected, mouse precision is accurate, stylus input rivals dedicated drawing tablets, voice input powered by AI is improving rapidly. The interaction gap between desktops and mobile devices is shrinking, and in some cases, mobile devices are actually more flexible. security and stability also play a role. Linux has always been praised for its robustness, and Android inherits much of that foundation. Sandboxed applications, permission-based access, and containerized environments make it harder for malware to spread. When you run Linux tools inside isolated environments on Android, you gain another layer of separation. For many users, this results in a system that feels safer and more predictable than traditional desktops plagued by background services, legacy drivers, and decades of backward compatibility. Battery life is another underrated advantage. Desktop operating systems were designed for machines plugged into walls. Android was designed for efficiency. When you use an Android device as a desktop, you benefit from aggressive power management, instant sleep and wake, and excellent thermal control. This means quieter systems, cooler operation, and longer usage without worrying about power consumption. For people who care about portability and energy efficiency, this is a huge win. The app ecosystem is also evolving. Android apps are no longer just simple mobile tools. Many are now full-featured, professional-grade applications. Combine that with Linux apps and web apps, and you get a layered ecosystem where you can choose the best tool for each task. Need a quick mobile app? It's there. Need a full Linux desktop application? Also, need a cloud-based tool? Open the browser. This flexibility is something traditional desktops struggle to match without becoming bloated and complex. What makes this trend even more interesting is that it's happening quietly. There's no single announcement declaring the end of desktops. Instead, there are small, steady improvements. Better desktop modes, faster Linux containers, improved window management, better driver support. Each update makes the experience slightly more usable, slightly more reliable. And then one day, people realize they've gone weeks without turning on their PC. Education is another area where this shift is becoming obvious. Students increasingly rely on phones and tablets for learning. When those devices can also run full Linux environments, the barrier to entry for technical education drops dramatically. You don't need a lab full of PCs, you don't need expensive hardware. You need a phone, a keyboard, and an internet connection. This democratizes access to computing in a way traditional desktops never could. Remote work further accelerates this change. When your main tools are cloud services, messaging platforms, and remote desktops, the local operating system matters less. Android devices can connect to remote Linux or Windows machines, access cloud desktops, and manage servers just as effectively as a traditional PC. In some cases, they do it more securely and with less maintenance. Critics often argue that Android and Linux still lack certain professional applications. And that's true to a point. Some niche software remains tied to specific platforms. But this argument becomes weaker every year. Alternatives improve, web-based tools replace native apps, virtualization and remote access fill the gaps. The question is no longer whether Android plus Linux can replace a desktop for everyone. It's whether it can replace it for most people. And for a growing number of users, the answer is already yes. There's also an economic angle that can't be ignored. A single device that acts as phone, tablet, and desktop is cheaper than maintaining multiple machines. It's easier to repair, easier to replace, and easier to carry. For businesses, this means lower hardware costs and simpler management. For individuals, it means less clutter and more freedom. As Linux desktop environments become more adaptable to touch and small screens, and as Android becomes more comfortable with keyboards and large displays, the two worlds meet in the middle. The result is not Android becoming Linux or Linux becoming Android, but a hybrid approach that takes the strengths of both simplicity and efficiency from Android, power and flexibility from Linux. This convergence also challenges the idea that desktops must look and behave a certain way. Traditional operating systems are often held back by legacy expectations. Android and Linux, especially in experimental setups, are more willing to rethink work. Window management, multitasking, notifications, and system settings can all be redesigned to fit modern usage patterns. This experimentation leads to innovation, something the desktop space desperately needs. What we're witnessing is not a sudden revolution, but a gradual replacement. Just like laptops slowly replaced desktops for many users, Android plus Linux is slowly replacing laptops, not by being better in every possible way, but by being good enough in most ways while offering advantages in portability, efficiency, and cost. The most interesting part is that this shift doesn't require people to switch in the traditional sense. You don't have to abandon everything you know. You simply start using your phone a bit more. You connect it to a screen. You install a Linux environment. You try doing real work on it. And then one day, you realize your desktop has become optional. In the end, Android plus Linux becoming a real desktop replacement is less about technology and more about mindset. It's about questioning why we need separate devices for tasks that can be handled by one. It's about recognizing that computing has changed and our tools should change with it. The future desktop may not sit under your desk or on your lap. It may already be in your pocket, quietly waiting for you to plug it in and take it seriously.